Adrianna, welcome to Podcastina.
Thanks for having me.
Thank you so much for doing the show today. When I discovered you, which was on TikTok, where I get so many of my favorite guests these days, I was like, I would kill to talk to an anthropologist. I have a very narrow idea of what I think the study is, but obviously, I would love for you to just go ahead and explain what it is that you work in.
Yeah, for sure. So anthropology is, a really broad discipline. So that's a question I get a lot on TikTok, a lot from a lot of people when I'm trying to explain to my parents, my grandparents, what I'm doing. But yeah, anthropology is basically the study of human beings anywhere we are in time and space in all of our glorious biocultural diversity. So in North America, we usually talk about anthropology as having four different subfields, those being archaeology, which would be the study of material culture in the past, um, sociocultural anthropology, which is studying various human cultures across the world, generally in the present. Um, Linguistic anthropology, which is sort of similar to linguistics, but looking at it from sort of cultural perspectives. And then biological anthropology, which is what I do as a PhD candidate. And that is looking at a whole variety of things from human biology to sort of forensic anthropology that people might know from watching TV shows like Bones, um, to like bioarchaeology, so studying skeletons at archaeological sites. All of those different disciplines have various subfields within them as well. But yeah, that's basically anthropology.
What motivated you to pick that lane?
um, yeah, so it's like a very long story because so I'm from Ontario. I did high school in Ontario, and in Ontario we do have a class in high school called SAP, which is sociology, anthropology, psychology. It's in grade 11. I did not take that class. I'd never taken anthropology before, and I was sort of trying to decide in my undergrad, what do I want to study? What am I applying for? Um, I love science, and I also really love humanities. Like I've always been really fascinated by history, by politics, but I also love like biology, chemistry, human evolution was always really fascinating to me. So I was looking around trying to find something that would let me look at all of those things and not sort of narrow myself down or have to choose something at that moment. And I just happened to stumble across a program description for an undergrad program that was like, we have this four subfields anthropology department where you can take all these different courses and look at different things. So that's sort of how I got into anthropology as a field.
Very cool. And can you talk to me about how that ties into mental health and productivity?
Yeah, for sure. So, yeah, like I said, I was sort of able to take all of these different anthropology courses throughout my undergrad. But also in undergrad, like many students in North America, I was really struggling with my own mental health and with sort of, um, yeah, with maintaining high academic productivity, handling those stresses that also come with, living on your own for the first time, navigating new relationships as an adult. Yeah, and just being in all these new spaces and navigating, in and sort of your relationships as a human being with different intersecting positionalities to the world at large, the geopolitical forces going on in the world that I'm sure many people can relate to now. And when I got to, what do I want to do in grad school? Because I'm a huge nerd and I really wanted to stay in academia. So like, what do I want my research to look like? What do I want to do in grad school? Um, I was sort of, I always had decided I was really interested in biological anthropology, but I also loved the theories that I was learning in my sociocultural anthropology courses. Um, and I was sort of doing this mental health advocacy because I was seeing this problem in myself and in my peers, and thought, how do I put those things together? Because I'm not really loving the way that maybe I've seen them, mental health talked about in, psychology didn't really speak to me. but I was like, I'm an anthropologist. How could I look at this anthropologically? How do I look at mental health as something that's, we're all interconnected. It's not necessarily something that's, individual, and like a pathology within us. Like sometimes it can be, and many people find it helpful to look at it that way. But for me, I saw it as something that was really embedded in relationships and our relationship to the environments that we're in. When I started my master's, I was looking at that in terms of the cultural environment. So I was looking at how do university students actually understand their own mental health, as embedded within the university context, within that environment, specifically in North America, because again, things are different
Mhm.
depending on where you are in the world. And anthropologists, we look at specifically your cultural context that you're in. So how are students sort of understanding their own identity as students, who are struggling with mental health, and how did that fit together? And one really key finding that came out of my master's work was that when I asked university students, like, how do you define mental health? Does mental health mean to you? What most people said to me was, well, mental health is, I know I'm mentally healthy when I'm productive,
Mm.
when I'm able to get things done, right? So that's sort of how anthropology tied into that, because I see that as coming from this embeddedness in a culture, that's patterned by neoliberalism, which is just the political structure, that sort of started to arise in the 80s with Reaganomics, which is just this idea that, as individuals, we are individually responsible for having this hyperproductivity, for maintaining this Protestant work ethic, for just being on go all the time and being very self-sacrificing in that way. And so it was interesting to me that people were defining their mental health in that way, as opposed to, what we might think of like when I'm feeling joy, when I'm feeling well rested. It was no, when I'm able to be productive, which maybe for people those things tie into that. But it was just an interesting as a cultural concept. Yeah, how that tied in. So again, just in terms of looking at mental health as something that is a relationship between ourselves and our environments, and our own definitions of that as being embedded in the cultural context in which we are existing.
On the one hand, hearing that is surprising because you do kind of anticipate, or at least maybe I would, that if you ask someone how their mental health is, at least knowing what I know now in my 30s, I would be like, oh, how much peace am I feeling? How centered is my nervous system? But you're so right. And I guess, yeah, it can be viewed as a thing that's like specific to North America, because people put their self-worth in how much they're getting done and the metrics and the validation that come with being really productive, like whether that's a high salary or, a lot of different awards that you get maybe in a certain area, or accolades by which we measure our careers. Would you say, is that getting worse as time goes on? Did your findings, did you discover that it's getting better? Like, what direction is it going?
Yeah, I would say in terms of like, my own study, that I did, that's sort of a snapshot of the time that we're in right now. Is it getting better or worse? I think that, um, in terms of thinking about things like neoliberalism, I think that's something that sort of is fairly new as a world order, right? When we think of the whole history of humanity being like 300,000 years old as a species, at least. Um, so in that way, I think our embeddedness in that, and the way that we're, defining mental health in that way as this productivity and needing to be hyper productive, arose fairly recently in the 80s. Is it getting worse over time? I think the anthropologist in me is saying maybe, but maybe it's getting better. In anthropology, we talk a lot about the myth of progress. And I think we see that a lot right now in the geopolitical moment that we're in. Um, Things change over time, right? Sometimes they get better, sometimes they get worse. Um, and as humans, I think sometimes we tend to view ourselves as on this, linear march towards progress. But really, things just change over time. And they change based on, historical factors, based on cultural factors. So I don't know, based on my findings, I can't necessarily say that, mental health and its connection to productivity is getting better or worse. Um, but I think having an awareness of the fact that we are being hyperproductive in this particular moment, and that that's not necessarily nurturing sort of joy for many people, I think is important in and of itself. And then we can work and see like where do we want sort of our culture to shift? How do we want to be part of this historical moment to sort of shift things going forward? And then we can create progress, because we are again, I talk about in my research both bodies and minds being shaped by, again, these relationships that we have with the environment, whether that's the physical environment or the cultural and historical environment that we're currently in. We're shaped by those, but we also have the choice to sort of shape those environments back. It's a mutually iterative relationship, and we do have that power, even if it's just little things, little small things every day in our individual relationships with others and with the environment.
Yeah, absolutely, and it's kind of related to how you hear about European lifestyle choices and that they take these siestas in the middle of the day and that they'll close their business down to go take a nap or have, like, a really long lunch, and I can see how that ties more into their history with capitalism and
Yeah.
probably their own structures with the way that things are geopolitically over there. I also wonder, is that in your findings, you were talking to, I'm assuming, primarily college students, so they're probably more centering their lives and, "Oh, I have to be productive because I'm in school and I have to achieve A, B, and C so that I can, like, move forward in my career." Do you think that that's, like, the general mindset for all Americans, or is it, like, worse in college students?
Yeah, that's a really interesting question. I think to some extent, it would be reasonable to make the guess that for many Americans that'll be the case, because sort of the macro culture that we're experiencing in North America is one of yeah, this pressure of we need to be hyper productive all the time. Sometimes, for university students, for college students, that's going to be oriented towards that academic productivity, getting those high grades, like you said, moving into those things and collecting those sort of awards, accolades, points that are going to in theory get you on this better career trajectory. But for people outside of the university setting, there's still that pressure to be hyper productive in your work setting, within relationships as well, with yeah, just relationships in general, in terms of yeah, being, good daughter, good wife, good husband, good neighbor. um, Obviously that's important, but there's like an element to productivity in there as well, and making sure that you're always busy and you're always doing all of these things. So I think that it's not, yeah, I don't think it would be unreasonable to think that many Americans are facing similar pressures in terms of their mental health, and also just in general that it's hard to maintain good mental health if we think of mental health, stepping away from the anthropological view for a minute to something that maybe you're measuring clinically with a scale of like, are you feeling sad? What sort of symptoms are you experiencing? It's hard to take care of yourself and do like appropriate self-care to sort of maintain those things, even just basic health things like sleeping, eating, drinking enough water. Um, it's hard to do that when you feel like you need to be maintaining productivity in all of these other areas. And then that was also a finding that we had in my study of like self-care then becomes this other thing that you have to do, and that
Mhm.
you have to be productive in, and that you are individually responsible for, even though you're embedded in a community and we need to be taking care of each other within our communities. um, and yeah, I don't think that's necessarily different outside of university settings. That being said, there's definitely an element of that sort of hyper productivity that's definitely going to be enhanced within that setting where you need to be getting good grades, and that ties into sort of your identity as a student.
That absolutely makes sense. This infatuation that we have with productivity, what is that stress doing to our bodies, like our own personal ecosystem? And then what is that doing in our relationships?
So, in terms of our own bodies, I mean, yeah, so I talk about a mindful body, or the mind body, which we talk a lot about in anthropology. If folks are interested, that comes from a paper by Nancy Shepherd Hughes and Margaret Locke in 1989, I think is the publication date, called The Mindful Body. And it's just this idea that we need to be thinking of the body and the mind as holistic. But yeah, in terms of what is this stress? So productivity coming up in our mind, making us unrestful, making us neglect our bodies in terms of getting enough food, getting enough sleep, um, resting in other ways that are productive to joy, is going to have health consequences for us, of course. I haven't necessarily studied stress in that way personally, but what I'm now doing as a biological anthropologist is I do look at how various stresses of all kinds, whether that's coming from this idea of hyperproductivity or other sources in childhood, is impacting our adult bodies in terms of like body shape and proportions in our limbs specifically is what I'm looking
Mm.
at right now. And so I can say, like, based on our findings, we were studying individuals from New Mexico from a database of CT scans. And things like socioeconomic status have an impact on your body proportions. Um, so people might not be reaching their full growth potential because they're putting energy maybe towards dealing with those stressors, is a hypothesis that I have. When we're looking at things like socioeconomic status, you're also seeing not getting enough energy to go towards growth because you might have material resource deficits. So you're food insecure, so you don't have enough to eat, or you might be needing to do more physical labor as a child at younger ages that could impact your development. Or, in the United States, when we're studying there, healthcare access is very difficult for folks from lower socioeconomic status, and fighting off infections, dealing with chronic illnesses without proper healthcare would also be something that takes energy away from children's ability to grow to their full growth potential. So we've seen that there. And then my current study that we're still working on, and I don't have findings for yet that have been analyzed, but looking at that stress that is arising from those relationships we have with people in our environment specifically, not looking at the more things like physiological impacts of things like malnutrition or healthcare access, but looking at what do people subjectively define as stressors, and is that impacting their bodies? I hypothesize that it will, because those stress reactions, things like activating your hypothalamic pituitary adrenal axis, that uses up a lot of energy. So in theory, I think we'll see some growth changes, but we're not sure yet. I haven't analyzed that data.
That's so fascinating. Going back to you saying the study involved even just people growing and their limbs, like what's been found? Are people getting shorter, or people having like shorter legs and arms? What are the findings?
Yeah. So, I mean, overall, right, there's been a secular trend for a long time, which just means overall in the most of the world where people have been measured over time, people have been getting taller.
Mm.
Um, what the research shows is a lot of that height growth has come from the lower limb, and specifically from the tibia, which is one of the bones in the bottom part of your leg. And the reason that we think that we see these secular trends is because of increased healthcare access in general, in sort of the modern era, and a better ability to fight off infectious disease because we have access to things like vaccines and like antibiotics. And so people are not suffering from those kind of illnesses for as long. Also increased access to nutrition for many folks. Obviously, there's inequalities around the world, but in general, those have been the trends that we've seen. And so people are getting taller. Huge amount of background to go back to. What I'm looking at is specifically then, okay, so certain parts of your body then are going to be more, we call it plastic, but more responsive to the environment. Because things like, for example, your head circumference or your torso length, those in general are more likely to grow to their full genetic maximum. They're more canalized, we would say, because you need that space specifically for your internal organs, for your brain. That's vital to your survival, that you grow those to sort of the maximum potential that they're supposed to be according to those genetic trajectories. But things like limbs, a centimeter couple millimeters off might not have those functional implications, is the theory. And so if we sort of look at, yeah, if we look at people's childhood environments and then we measure their limbs, we control for sort of that overall body size by measuring something and putting it into a statistical model in terms of head circumference or torso length or something else. Proportionally, then, are people's limbs smaller if they've experienced more stress, and we would expect them to be shorter limbs proportionally if they'd experienced more stress, longer limbs proportionally if they'd experienced less stress or fewer stressors. What other folks have found is that, socioeconomic status is pretty firmly associated with lower socioeconomic status, shorter limbs proportionally, particularly in sort of these bones. So your ulna in your forearm and your tibia, like I said, in the bottom part of your leg. Those are sort of known to be the more plastic or more responsive to the environment and environmental deficits. Other things, various other factors have been associated. Like I said, and what I'm currently studying is to see if those things that we know are impacted by, malnutrition, sorry, would be the other one, and infectious disease. And then what I'm currently looking at is, does that pattern hold when we look at like control for things like people, we're looking in a population that, is well fed, does have healthcare access, does how they experience stress in childhood in terms of psychosocial stressors, their relationships with people, their relationship with their environment, is that impacting? And we'll see what we find soon, hopefully.
That's remarkable. I've never heard that before. I guess this is just like a technical question related to that.
Yeah.
Maybe you know it or not, but are they measuring like if your limbs, let's say, end up shorter because you're coming from one of these lower socioeconomic areas and you don't have enough access to healthcare or nutritional food? Do they look at the potential for the length of the limb based on the parents, or is there like a DNA sequence these days that they can look at and be like, oh, it was supposed to be 15 inches and it's 14?
Okay. Yeah. We don't know really. I'm sort of using genetic potential very loosely because, we can't necessarily look at either parents or a genetic sequence and know precisely like this is how tall someone was meant to be. We're going off of sort of the assumption or the hypothesis that something like head circumference or torso length that's more canalized, so it's less likely to be impacted by any stressors during development. If we look at those dimensions, that sort of controls for the overall body size that someone had. So if we sort of were graphing something, we'd be looking at like limb length for a given torso length sort of thing. They might not have reached those genetic maximums. There might be lots of other things going on from the environment, but that sort of helps us to control for just people in general having different body sizes because of, different genetics.
What is it that you have learned so far about stress in general that you're like, oh, I wish everybody knew this?
I think, for starters, I think it's important for people to recognize that like stress is a part of being human, and that like some scholars will distinguish between sort of eustress and distress, and there's this idea that like some stress, we need to experience a little bit of stress to help us grow, to keep us like for example, when you do a workout, that's stressful to your muscles. If we use like a physiological metaphor, or physiological stressor, you do a workout that's stressful for your muscles, but then you do that within your limits, and then you become stronger. And I think the same goes for other types of stresses, but we also want to make sure that we're not overdoing it. We're not being hyper productive. No one, deserves to be stressed all the time, especially as children. And we need to sort of, as humans, we're a gregarious species. We're a social species. We're meant to work together as a community to help each other through stress. So we're all going to experience it, but I think, the most important thing is we're sort of there for each other. And that stress has impacts. The things that are going on in your mind that you're stressed about are impacting your physical body. We can't separate the mind and the body, and those things are are sort of holistic and together, and we should think about them together and care for ourselves and for others as whole people.
When children specifically are experiencing stress, because it doesn't just start in college, right? It starts as soon as you can comprehend what's going on around you. Other than potentially getting shorter, are there any other kinds of biological markers that you're seeing with kids that experience like an irregular amount of stress, let's say?
I'm sure that there are. Those are the ones. So growth is what I study in particular. So I don't necessarily know other ones super well.
So I understand your focus has been more in a North American culture, but have you learned anything about how maybe different cultures interpret mental health that you can speak to?
Yeah, again, like different cultures from all over the world are going to have different ideas about what mental health is, what is mentally healthy, what is mentally unhealthy, based on the constructs that folks have for what is a good life, what are the values that people have in that society, um, and what resources they have to achieve that. It's very hard to define. What is mental health like when you're living in a war zone, and what is maybe not what is mental health, but what is a mental illness when you're living somewhere like a war zone, when you don't have access to food, you're food insecure for your entire life, and those things are coming from impacts like colonialism. You can't isolate that within a person. So that's something that would impact, how people are understanding and defining mental health versus mental illness versus, just general mental unwellness around the world based on those different things that people are experiencing that are coming from, whether those are macro level forces or things that are more specific to the particular environment. um, Something that people tend to get interested in when looking at sort of mental illness and in different societies is this idea of it's often called culture bound syndromes. So there's some sort of things, if we think of mental illness as diagnosable units, that appear in different cultures, which is something that's really interesting and sort of, to me, again, as an anthropologist, goes, maybe not all mental illnesses are, or mental illness works in a different way from something like an infectious disease where we can identify like a specific organism or virus that's like causing people distress. Mental illnesses are more cultural constructs that are obviously causing people distress and need to be cared for, but how that manifests and how that appears is going to be different in different cultures, again based on how people understand their own bodies, their own minds, and how that relates to their environments. Like there's some interesting discussion in the anthropological research about things like premenstrual syndrome being maybe a culture bound syndrome
Mm.
for like sort of Euro-American and even American like cultures, because that's experienced differently. Again, based on the ways we understand our bodies, based on things like patriarchy, as well as just the number of times, for example, that a woman will get, or a person with a uterus will get their period over the course of their lifetime, compared to someone who's maybe in a culture or group where they don't have access to contraception, for example, or don't have access to as many food resources, and so might not have the energy to do that every month. And so that'll impact, again, how you understand your own body, and how your mental health appears in different cultural groups.
That makes perfect sense, and it's gonna vary so much based on
Yeah.
what that particular culture is going through at this moment and the generations that are dealing with war and famine, as you spoke to. Um, we s You spoke a little bit on, like, different cultures and the social constructs, so I wanted to ask, and I know you don't study race specifically, but what in anthropology is the discussion around race? Like, what education should people be getting on the subject?
Yeah, so I think the most important thing is that, race is not something that is biologically real in human beings. Yeah, race is not real now. It has never been real in the past. As it comes to an accurate representation of sort of human biological variation. Humans are actually one of the most genetically identical species on the planet.
Wow.
We have a huge, huge amount of, it's called phenotypic diversity. So just the ways that we look is what phenotype means. So we have a huge range of that. We all look super different from one another. But our genetics are actually really, really similar. And there's no like way to divide humans up into different races in a way that makes any biological or genetic sense. Racism, on the other hand, is very real. And racism can have an impact on people's health, and does have an impact on people's health. It has an impact on how you're treated within health systems. Um, and it has an impact in terms of people not having less access to resources because of social hierarchies that have been based on racism. Um, so I think that's sort of the bottom line on race and anthropology and biological anthropology in particular, is that race is not a real or accurate representation of human biological variation, but racism is experienced by people, and that does impact it does impact their health, and so their bodies in various ways, and that is very real. That is a very real experience that people are having, and holding both of those concepts together is really important when we're studying people's different experiences and the experiences that they have at the intersections of their different identities.
Yeah, that's such a crucial distinction to make, is that the racism impacts are real. Is there any kind of particular like physiological manifestations that you know of that happen from someone experiencing intense racism?
I don't know that they would be things that are like unique to racism, but they would come from, sort of, it would be the same as any sort of discrimination that people are experiencing. So your body doesn't necessarily know, oh, I'm experiencing racism versus another form of discrimination or another form of deprivation, really, because that's what it's going to be. But it would be, yeah, things like going into a healthcare system, accessing healthcare, and not, and Black women, for instance, in America, try and access healthcare and are treated because historically there's been this idea from doctors based on racism that Black folks don't experience pain the way that white folks do. It's a super racist concept. And so they're going to treat Black women differently, for example, when they're going in for maternal care, differently than they would treat a white woman in the same circumstance. And that results in increased maternal mortality for Black women, would be one example of how that would manifest. So it's just based on the choices that other people are making in terms of because they're acting on their own racist beliefs and depriving other people of resources that we all deserve, like equal access to food, to shelter, to healthcare.
Yeah, that makes sense. And just more stress in general to be going through. Obviously, what's never not going to be a stressful experience.
Exactly.
So, you told me that you're working on studying eldest daughters and the impact that, I guess, would you call it a familial position, has on a person's development. Can you tell me more about that?
Yeah, for sure. So this is a project that I've just started sort of writing up project proposals for. It's in its very baby stages, infant stages, if you will. But basically, so like I said, what I've been doing right now in my doctoral research is I have people come into the lab. I measure their different limb lengths, and then we sit down and we do a semi-structured interview. And I say, tell me about your childhood and tell me what caused you a subjective sense of stress, like psychosocial stress in your life as a child and as a teenager or adolescent. And I've had people will come in, and a theme that I've noticed. So as I said, I haven't analyzed this data yet, but just sitting down and talking to people, as I've had a lot of eldest daughters telling me that, listen, so much of my stress as a child came from, whether it's this parentification or feeling the need to be perfect, that perfectionism, or just, taking on these increased caretaking responsibilities for their younger siblings and for their parents, even in some cases, is causing them a sense of stress. And then, also the more interesting thing, almost because, I'm also an eldest daughter. So that was sort of not
I was going to ask.
necessarily, yeah, that was not necessarily surprising to me as an eldest daughter who has lots of friends who are also eldest daughters. Anecdotally, I think many of us know this to be true. But what was also really interesting to me was that I had younger siblings who were coming in and actually identifying and telling me, oh, I actually didn't, my parents got divorced, for example. And most people would find that really, stressful. But my older sister, buffered me against that stressor. She made sure that, I was still getting to all my sports practices. I was still able to do extracurriculars. I didn't necessarily know what was going on. She made sure I wasn't there if there was any fighting going on. And now as an adult, I recognize that she was probably really stressed about that, but I wasn't, because she was there to sort of protect me and guide me through it. Or another example would be, starting high school, I was really nervous about it, but my older sister, was 4 years older, that she'd just gone through it. She was really familiar with all the teachers and sat me down and talked about this is how you study properly. And this is how you, navigate these social and educational environments. So like I said, I haven't analyzed that data, but just these themes started, making me curious about how does that manifest biologically? And we've heard, I think on TikTok, again, you found me on TikTok. It went viral a couple of years ago. I believe it was a family therapist was talking about this idea that she labeled as eldest daughter syndrome. That again, a lot of people relate to. It went super viral. There's lots of pop culture articles about it, but there isn't actually a lot of academic peer-reviewed research on the topic. There's actually very little on eldest daughters as there is on women in general are under-researched. And so then I was very curious. Again, I'm an anthropologist. I'm interested in the social aspects of things. I'm interested in the biological aspects of things. So my brain is thinking what does socialization as an eldest daughter in a particular cultural context, how does that impact our bodies? Whether that's in terms of growth, whether that's in terms of, maybe the reproductive decisions we're making, or how those systems are operating physiologically within us, and various other biomarkers and social markers of well-being, whether that's mental well-being or physical well-being. So I have many, many questions about it that I'm really excited to explore. Yeah.
Did you stumble upon this, or did you specifically do it because you're an eldest daughter and you had your suspicions?
I think it was, I wasn't thinking about my own positionality necessarily as an eldest daughter until I had people coming in to the lab, and we were sitting down and having these conversations about their stress. And I was going, yeah, I really relate to that. And again, as an anthropologist, positionality is really important in our research. It's always something that often people, at the beginning of articles in their methods section might say, this is my positionality. This is how I relate to the topic being studied, whether that's stating that they are an outsider researching it, or whether they're stating these are my sort of connections and how that might alter my view or my interpretation or my analysis of the things that I'm finding. And so, yeah, people started coming in, and I'm sure that I picked up on this theme right away because I'm an eldest daughter and I related to those things that people were saying. I'm sure there's lots of other stress themes that'll come out when I sit down and do proper, thorough coding. But yeah, so in that way, I think I stumbled upon it. And then just, I become more interested in studying women as well going forward. Super interested in the things that have come from studying a whole range of people with different gendered experiences. But, I am a woman, and going forward and thinking, what do I want my career to look like? Who do I want to come in and talk to and learn more about? Whose lives do I want to talk about? I feel most comfortable sort of, talking about people who I have that sort of relationality to. And of course, all humans have this huge diversity of experiences, no matter what our identities are, even if they might be very, very superficially similar. But I think when you have those moments of connection, or those points of connections identity wise with people, whether that's being a woman, being an eldest daughter, I think that gives something extra to my analysis as an anthropologist and my understanding. So that was sort of yeah, also a way of like, what do I want to study in my career? And this is a way to sort of move in that direction of well-being and women's well-being, by looking at sort of a very specific phenomenon that hasn't really been studied.
I got like goosebumps when you said that because, as I told you in our pre-interview, I had just finished a book called Invisible Women, and now I'm like trying to make sure everybody reads this book, and it specifically goes to point out the data gap. So the gap that you're trying to work to close of how there's just all this information that's lacking when it comes to women's safety with car regulations or how bathrooms should be built. Like there's all these different avenues where tests were either exclusively done on men or they just weren't done in equal numbers for women, and that it's just not even been addressed until very, very recently. So it's super exciting to hear that you're doing that, and that you're going to be part of the solution. Is there like, what are the kinds of questions that you're looking to answer in this eldest daughter study?
Yeah, I think to start, I'm interested in, yeah, how do we socialize people into this? What is the role of eldest daughter? What does that look like, first of all, socially? And what processes get us there? So, we talk about it, like people talk about it all the time, again, anecdotally on TikTok and other pop culture sources about this idea of sort of this overachieving, perfectionist, strong leadership qualities. Is that how many eldest daughters understand themselves when we sort of look at it in a very systematic way? Are there other things that we're maybe not picking up on in those pop culture sources, that are aspects of how eldest daughters see themselves within that relationship within their family network? And how do we get there? How does that socialization process occur? Is it, sort of a blending of people being socialized, into sort of a feminine role because, they're young girls, or is it, and like combining with the fact that, oh, I'm also the eldest sibling, so just naturally are put in charge of things because you're older, coming together? Is there like some sort of separate process that's going on? Specifically, what does that look like? How are we making eldest daughters, socially? And then what impacts does that then have on eldest daughters in their adulthood in terms of their mindful bodies? So again, looking at those metrics of sort of well-being, in terms of mental well-being, but also in terms of growth outcomes and potentially other biomarkers. And then, yeah, what does it matter, if what type of care it is? Are all eldest daughters sort of experiencing different growth patterns, or does it matter, how those family relations actually came together, in reality? So like, is there an amount of like sibling care that you have to be giving to have different impacts on well-being into adulthood? Is that different across a different range of things? Questions in their infancy, but all sort of curiosities I have now that I'm very excited to hopefully get to explore.
Yeah, it's such a rich subject matter, and that I would be curious too if being an eldest daughter, and especially depending on how many kids are in the family and like if the parents are still together, obviously there's like a ton of different variables here, but if that's like going to make those daughters be either more likely to have big families themselves, or on the flip side, is it going to make them reluctant to have children because maybe they spent so much time doing childbearing activities where it's like, okay, enough.
Yeah, when I first started thinking about it, I wasn't really thinking about reproductive choice, in that way. And then I started like, okay, what do we know about eldest daughters? That's the first step of, making a research project, is like, what is known? And when I was sort of like, oh, actually, not a lot of it is known academically. What are the pop culture sources? And there is sort of this trope, right? I feel like in a lot of, I can think of like a number of sitcom examples, for example, where it's like, yeah, the conflict is sort of the wife or the girlfriend doesn't want children because she raised all of these siblings and she's just sort of done. And that seems to be a recurring trope. Is that happening in real life, or is that just something that's interesting in fiction? Yeah, another curiosity for sure.
Have there been studies that you're aware of on other positions in the family? Like, I'm an only child. Do you know of anything that's been done about that?
I'm sure there are. studies in other disciplines that I haven't necessarily come across. Within anthropology, and with specifically within biological anthropology, sort of the literature or like theoretical tradition that I'm looking in is within the information on alloparenting. So alloparenting is any care given by an individual that's not a mother.
Mm.
The idea being that in humans, alloparents are very evolutionarily important because we have superaltricial offspring, which just means when we have babies, our babies are like not able to take care of themselves at all for a very long time. Humans actually, childhood is not something that occurs as a developmental stage in other animals. There have been arguments that actually humans are the only animals with sort of this childhood stage. Most social animals have a juvenile stage. Um, but not this sort of stage where you can kind of walk and talk and move around on your own, but you're still relying on adults for food. It's not milk per se, but you still need adults to provision you with food. And sorry, I've gone off on a little ramble and lost my train of thought. We'll get it
That's
back.
okay.
Other studies, yeah, and alloparenting. So basically, yeah, for a long period of time, human children need care from others, but that doesn't necessarily have to be a mother at all times, or the individual that like gave birth to that individual. And it's super important in human societies to have all these different types of alloparents. And so there's been lots of research on different categories within the family in that way. So there's been research on like fathers providing alloparental care and how that's important and the ways that that manifests in different types of family structures across different cultures. I read a lot about maternal uncles was one that has been kind of studied because people have been interested in like how does passing down property across generations in matriarchal societies where sometimes men still control like property, but descent is passed matrilineal. How does that work? Does how much care a matrilineal or a mother's brother gives her children impact that? So those are two that I can kind of think of. Grandmothers, thinking about the role, how important grandmothers are evolutionarily to humans is like a big hypothesis that lots of people have studied, this idea that that's the reason maybe that women experience menopause, because even though they're no longer able to have children themselves, it's important for them to keep being there, being available, and part of the family so that they can provide care to young children. Yeah, so lots of different things in that way, not so much within anthropology that I'm aware of in terms of different sibling dynamics. But that would be super interesting.
Yeah, I just recently learned about that hypothesis that we stick around for menopause and on average live longer than men for that reason because like the tribe needs the grandmother's wisdom to keep raising kids even if they're not yours, even if they're the grandkids. So that's just such an endlessly fascinating thing that I would love to go down a rabbit hole some other time about. Is there like an awareness, do you think, with eldest daughters that they're contributing unpaid labor? Does it seem to feel like labor to the people that you've spoken to?
Yeah, I think so. I think that there is this sense that, yeah, they're doing a lot of domestic labor that's not necessarily age appropriate in the cultural context in which they are in. Even though lots of eldest daughters are experiencing that, there's this idea, right, that childhood is sort of this labor-free, the one labor-free sort of period that you have. And I think there is an awareness that, yeah, we're, taking care of our siblings when we're like youth ourselves, and that isn't being compensated for sort of in any way. Although I have as I'm reading through the literature, there's lots of different ethnographic examples that aren't necessarily specifically looking at eldest daughters, but are looking at sort of different, just writing about experiences within families. And we're talking about how eldest daughters are providing care, and often that's part of being a good daughter and understanding yourself as being a good daughter. It gives you leadership skills for the future that might result in higher academic achievement or like various things like that. So there's definitely, I think people experience stress from it, but people also experience a sense of identity and pride. And caring for other people can be a good thing. It's just in terms of, is it age appropriate, and what is sort of the dosage, for lack of a better term.
I wonder if at all, and maybe this is something you're studying, I guess I'm asking if this is part of the study, do you think that it leads to more of like a type A personality outcome?
I think that's what's being talked about in terms of those like pop culture references to it. So I think it'd be interesting to see if that actually, when it's studied sort of in a more scientific way, yeah, does that come forward? Because I think that's definitely an aspect of what people, when they're talking about sort of on TikTok, having these conversations about what being an eldest daughter is like, those aspects of like, yeah, having to be very organized and that leading to perfectionism, and those things that we might associate with sort of type A. Um, yeah, so it'd be interesting to see.
How long is the study from start to finish to publication?
I'm not. So I'm currently in going into the last year of my PhD. So I'm applying sort of for postdoc funding right now. So hopefully it'll be a 2-year project that would start in September 2026. But we'll see. And then, there's lots, like I said, there's so many questions coming from this. Maybe it's something I continue working on for my career. Maybe it's a 40-year project.
That's so cool. Well, I have learned so much talking to you today. Adrianna Wiley, if people want to learn more about your work, how do they find you?
They can find me on TikTok at anthropology #4 Homo sapiens. You can find me at the same at on YouTube as well, or you can always reach out on email. I'm at the University of Toronto, and I'm always happy to chat about my research.
Very cool. Thank you so much for joining me today.
Thank you.
And thank you, everybody, for listening. Bye.